Here's a quick question for you. What does Panama, Pablo Escobar, the Contras, Sandinista Revolution, El Salvadorian Dirty War, the 1976 U.S. presidential election, war on drugs, Cuban intelligence, apartheid South Africa, East German Stasi, Iran-Contra affair, U.S. invasion of Panama, and Harvard College all have in common? The answer is Manuel Noriega. Manuel Noriega was commissioned in the Panamanian National Guard in 1962, and throughout his career and time in the Panamanian Guard, Noriega gained a terrible reputation of alcoholism, attacking and assaulting random people, and eventually mass drug trafficking. In 1966, Noriega participated in courses on infantry operations, counterintelligence, intelligence, and jungle warfare. He also took a course on psychological operations at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, now called Fort Liberty. In 1967, the Johnson administration concluded that Noriega would be a valuable asset as he was a rising star in the Panamanian military, and boy would they be right and wrong at the same time. In 1968, Arnulfo Arias won the Panamanian presidential election and began a mass purge of the National Guard. In response, Brigadier General Omar Torrijos staged a coup to overthrow the government and became the leader of Panama from 1968 to 1981. Torrijos was actually a pretty good ruler as he reformed much of the country, but he would die in a suspicious plane crash. Meanwhile, Noriega was promoted to lieutenant colonel and made chief of military intelligence. While Arias' supporters launched a guerrilla campaign uprising in his home province, Noriega, as head of intelligence, played an important role in putting down the uprisings within a year and was quite brutal about it. By the early 1970s, American law enforcement officials had reports of Noriega's possible involvement with the narcotics trafficking, and he was definitely trafficking narcotics. Though Torrijos had frequently promised the U.S. cooperation in dealing with drug smuggling, Noriega would have been the guy to head the effort in Panamanian cooperation at enforcement, and the U.S. began to see Noriega as an obstacle to combating drug smuggling. There were even a few plans to assassinate Noriega due to this factor. However, all of these plans were scrapped. In 1990, it would also be discovered that Noriega had been linked to a series of bombing targets in the U.S. territories in the Panama Canal Zone during the prelude to the U.S. presidential election of 1976. Noriega's drug-related activities came to the U.S. government's attention once again during the ratification process of the Canal Treaties. In December of 1976, when meeting with George H.W. Bush, the then director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Noriega flatly denied any involvement in the drug trade and claimed that it was all a CIA plot to discredit him, even though Noriega was definitely the one dealing tons of drugs at the time. Because of Noriega's position as head of Panama's intelligence agency, Noriega would enter the payroll of the Central Intelligence Agency on a case-by-case basis in exchange for information. The CIA valued him as an asset because he was willing to provide information about the Cuban government. Although payments to him were stopped for a while because Noriega was a pretty bad dude, the Sandinista Revolution had begun, and the CIA paid him for intel about the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Although he was providing intel about Cuba to the United States, Noriega also pulled an Uno reverse card and sold information and intelligence about the U.S. to the Cubans. During the Sandinista Revolution in Nicaragua, Noriega provided the communists with surplus Panamanian National Guard equipment and also acted as a cover for Cuban arms shipments to Nicaragua. Noriega also arranged for weapons purchases in the U.S. to be shipped to the Sandinista forces in a deal which made him so much profit and was very embarrassing for the Carter administration. Noriega also shipped weapons to leftist rebels in El Salvador, which he was reprimanded for, but Noriega continued to be an arms dealer and drug smuggler anyway. After Torrijos' death in 1981, Manuel Noriega would eventually come to power in 1983, just before democratic elections were supposed to take place. Noriega's rule became increasingly repressive, even as the U.S. government under Ronald Reagan began relying on him in covert efforts to undermine Nicaragua's Sandinista government, which Noriega had helped put in place. Reagan's relationship with Noriega was very mixed, to say the least. On the one hand, Reagan needed allies in Latin America, and Noriega also had a lot of intelligence on Nicaragua and Cuba because, he had been dealing with them for quite a while and giving them guns and all crap like that. On the other hand, Noriega was a massive drug dealer who had previously been backing commies, and Noriega had been partially responsible for creating the El Salvadorian Dirty War. Noriega offered to allow the U.S. to create listing posts and spy plane airfields in Panama, and Reagan chose to work with him, temporarily at least. Additionally, Noriega was deeply involved in the training of the Contras and the Iran-Contra affair, which would be a big scandal later on. However, Panama and therefore Noriega's involvement in drug trafficking during this time grew considerably over the early 1980s and peaked in 1984. Intensifying conflicts in Colombia, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua had led to the creation of a covert transportation network that Noriega used to transport drugs to the United States, and primarily this was cocaine. During this period, Colombia's Medellin cartel was also seeking allies, and Noriega became pretty intimate with them and was involved with their drug trafficking, money laundering operations, and he received considerable sums of protection money, bribes, or shares of the profits with Escobar. But because of Noriega's new relationship with the United States, he had raided a cocaine plantation in Panama to show off his commitment to the war on drugs. He also ordered a crackdown on money laundering by Colombian cartel figures, and due to his appearance as an anti-drug figure, Noriega was invited to Harvard University in 1985 as a guest speaker. But, of course, he was just pretty much raiding his competition. Also, although he had scaled back some of his drug smuggling, he was very deep in it. Also, his arms dealing with communists was unfazed in the 1980s. Noriega mediated a deal with the East German Stasi to sell Soviet weapons and equipment to apartheid South Africa, but when the weapons were all seized in Panama, Noriega backed out of the deal. However, Noriega kept selling U.S. intelligence to Cuba throughout the 1980s. As if all of that wasn't bad enough, Noriega would also murder Hugo Spadafora, who was a physician and political activist who had first clashed with Noriega when they were both members of Torrijos' government. Spadafora had evidence of Noriega's corruption and massive drug dealings over the past decade and was going to expose the dictator and was murdered in 1985. In 1987, thousands of Panamanians protested his murder, and as a result, the U.S. suspended all military assistance to Panama and the CIA stopped paying Noriega. By 1988, the Reagan administration began pressuring Noriega to step down and was also planning an invasion of Panama to topple Noriega because of his massive drug empire, and of course they had had enough with him, backstabbing them a ton of times with the commies. Noriega was indicted by U.S. federal grand juries in courts in Miami and Tampa, Florida, on charges of drug trafficking. The indictments accused him of turning Panama into a shipping platform for South American cocaine that was destined for the United States and for allowing drug proceeds to be hidden in Panamanian banks. Additionally, Noriega rigged and refused to step down after losing the Panamanian 1989 election, and even Jimmy Carter got on board with the idea of getting rid of Noriega. Panamanian military forces then began planning coups to overthrow him throughout 1989, and a major failed plot came about in October. The writing was on the wall, and in December of 1989, President George H.W. Bush initiated Operation Just Cause, the U.S. invasion of Panama. The war only lasted a month long and was the largest U.S. military action since the Vietnam War. Noriega took refuge in the Vatican embassy where he threatened to wage a guerrilla war if he wasn't given sanctuary. Delta Force then set up a perimeter around the building and played loud rock and roll music outside to troll Noriega. After 10 days, Noriega surrendered on January 3, 1990. 92% of Panamanian adults supported the U.S. incursion and invasion in Panama, and 76% had even wished that the U.S. forces had invaded in October during the coup. Noriega was arrested and convicted in the U.S., Panama, and France. America sentenced him to 40 years imprisonment, France sentenced him to 7 years imprisonment, and Panama gave him 60 years. Now you might wonder why France had any reason to charge Noriega at all, and it was because he was charged in France with laundering $3 million in drug proceeds in Paris. Other charges in the U.S. and Panama included, but are limited to, money laundering, drug trafficking, crimes against humanity, murder, racketeering, and conspiracy. Now, there's a lot more to Noriega's drug trafficking, arms dealing, repressive rule, and more, but this is merely a summary video. Did you know about Manuel Noriega, the Panamanian dictator and drug trafficker before this video? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.